Once again, I welcome you to yet another lesson of the Daniel and Revelation Bible Study program. And we are still dealing with the subject of the seven seals. And as per the study that we have done in the last two lessons, there are some important points to keep in mind before we begin our study in this lesson. Firstly, the seals represent a continuous chain of events. And the seals are also the different periods into which the history of the church is being divided into. So, till now, we have only touched upon the first six seals. So, in this lesson, we are going to study seal number 7. In fact, we're studying the seventh seal and the trumpets. We shall start by reading Revelation chapter 8, beginning at verse 1. And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of an hour. Now, I want to stop here for a moment, and I would just like to comment on the silence that appears when the seventh seal is opened. Initially, it was taught and believed that this silence marked the second coming of Jesus Christ. And the second coming of Jesus Christ was the reason why heaven was silent or remained silent, because when Jesus comes again the second time, all the heavenly beings would assist or would accompany him in his journey from heaven to earth and back to heaven, of course. In that sense, heaven has become a silent place, or heaven has become a place that is characterized by a silence that lasts for an hour. Now, this period of 1 hour of silence also represents a period of about 14 to 15 days, according to this teaching. In other words, it would take him about 14 days or to 15 days to complete this journey. In other words, the seventh seal was believed to refer to the second coming of Jesus. This interpretation, however, is questionable on grounds that John did not say anything about Jesus and all the heavenly beings exiting heaven. And if you continue to read in verse 2 of Revelation chapter 8, you will find the following account being given by John, where it says, "And I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given seven trumpets." Now, for you to understand what I'm trying to say here, it is important that I should read to you both the verses 1 and 2, and in one shot. And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of an hour. And I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. So now here you get a more comprehensive picture of what John saw. When the seventh seal was opened, John saw that there was silence. And in addition to that, he also saw seven angels that were each given a trumpet, was standing before the throne of God. Now, what were these angels doing there? To know the answer, we have to skip to verse 6, where it says, "And the seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepare themselves to sound." In other words, these three verses suggest that these angels were silently waiting for God to command them to blow the trumpets. And besides the seven angels, this chapter also talks about another angel, the an eighth angel, who came out and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar, and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. So, as per the accounts that I have read to you, I've showed you, that appear in chapter 8, do not prove that the seventh seal has anything to do with the second coming of Jesus Christ. So, how are we supposed to understand the silence that appears in the first verse of chapter 8. Remember that we are dealing with events that occur in a sequential order. Therefore, to understand what we are dealing with in seal number 7, we need to recall what happened in seal number 6. Now, seal number 6 opens with an outbreak of cosmic events, after which we are told that the kings of the earth and the great men and the chief captains and the mighty men and every born man and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? So we see here that among other things, this passage also mentions the day of God's wrath. Now, an important point has to be noted here. That is, the day of God's wrath does not begin at seal number 6. These calamitous events that appear when the sixth seal was opened was simply a signal from God that the day of his wrath is about to come. So to understand more clearly what we read in seal number 6, or to understand what I'm trying to say, let us turn to the Old Testament scriptures, where we read the following account in Zephaniah chapter 1 verse 14 to 18. And the great day of the Lord is near. It is near, and hasteth greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. The mighty men shall cry there bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, and a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of thick clouds and thick darkness, a day of the trumpet and alarm against the fenced cities and against the high towers. And I will bring distress upon men, that they shall walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord. And the blood shall be poured out as dust, and the flesh as dung. Neither the silver nor the gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath, but the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy, for he shall make a speedy riddance of all them that dwell in the land. So, as per the accounts of the prophet Zephaniah, we find that the great day of God's wrath is a day when God punishes the wicked because they have sinned against him. It is a day of utter destruction and desolation and distress. And we also saw that Zephaniah likens the day of God's wrath as the day of the trumpet. Now, where do we find the trumpets mentioned in the context of the seals? The answer is seal number 7. This is evidently clear from what we had read a while ago, that when the seventh seal was opened, what John saw was the 7 angels with the trumpets standing before God, waiting upon God to give them the command to blow the trumpets. And notice how Zephaniah puts it when he says that this day is the day of trumpet and alarm against the fenced cities and against the high towers. Now, this is a very similar to the account about the fall of Jericho. The sound of trumpets were music to the ears of God's people, but that very same sound spells doom to the enemies of God's people. In other words, the silence that appears in the 7th seal is associated with a strange act of God, where we read about in Isaiah chapter 28 verse 21. For the Lord shall rise up in Mount Perazim, he shall be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work and bring to pass his act, his strange act. So this strange act of God is definitely contrary to the nature and character of God. God is not pleased, or he does not delight in the destruction of the wicked, which we read about in Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 23 and verses 31 and 32. So how do we understand the silence? This silence is understood as the reaction or the response that heaven gives to the strange act of God. The heavenly beings are speechless at what they are about to witness. Because now God is about to perform an act which is not seen or heard of before, which the Bible also chooses to name this act or this period where God would perform this act as the time of trouble. And we read about this in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. This brings us to the next point, that the trumpets are not only part of the seven seals. This brings us to the next point, that the trumpets are not only part of the seventh seal, but they are also associated with the great day of God's wrath. In other words, the trumpets, or the seven trumpets, are in fact the seven last plagues. Now, how can we come to this conclusion? Again, we are dealing with a continuous chain of events. And if you remember that in seal number 6, a question was being asked, who shall be able to stand, or who shall be able to escape the day of God's wrath? And this question was dealt with in the last lesson of this series, where we had found out that Revelation 7 tells us that only those who were sealed with God's seal on their foreheads will be able to escape the wrath of God. And this is in line with what we had just read in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, where we are told that when the day of trouble comes, or when the day of God's wrath arrives, the people who will be delivered are those whose names are found written in the book. Now, I believe that this book is the book of life, where the names of those people who are worthy of inheriting heaven and eternal life are being recorded in this book. In other words, these are the same people who are sealed with the seal of the living God. So, based on the question that was asked in seal number 6, the next thing we ought to expect is the unleashing of God's wrath in the form of the seven last plagues. So, this is one way of, and this is one proof, evidence to show that the seven trumpets represent the seven last plagues. Now, we can also be certain that the seven trumpets are the seven last plagues when we go back to Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 16. There we find that Zephaniah describes the day of God's wrath as the day of trumpets. And it is very interesting that in Revelation chapter 15, verse 1, and in Revelation chapter 16, verse 1, John, in speaking about the seven last plagues, he mentions that these plagues have something to do with the wrath of God. Now, I'm going to read first of all Revelation chapter 15, verse 1. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. For in them is filled up the wrath of God. Now compare this quotation with what is being written in Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, where it says, And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the 7 angels, Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God. So we see here that these vials, or these plagues that these 7 angels were about to pour on the earth were what? They are the wrath of God. So when we compare the trumpets and the plagues, you will notice that each trumpet affects the same geographical region as the corresponding plague. Now we've given here a table where on the left we have the trumpets and on the right we have the plagues. And we notice in the first plague that hail and fire mingled with blood were cast upon the earth. And the first plague affected the earth. And then the second trumpet, the sea was affected. And so also we see that the second plague, it is the sea that was affected. And then the third trumpet, A great star fell from heaven, and it fell upon the rivers and fountains of water. And the third plague was poured upon the rivers and the fountains of water. The fourth trumpet affected the sun. And we are told in Revelation chapter 16, verse 8, that the fourth vial or the fourth plague was poured upon the sun. The fifth trumpet opens up the bottomless pit, and the fifth plague was poured upon the seat of the beast. Now, there's a relation between the beast and the bottomless pit, and this you will be able to understand when we deal with Revelation chapter 13. Now, the sixth trumpet deals with the angels that were bound to the river Euphrates were being loosed. And we also read in Revelation chapter 16 that when the sixth plague was being poured, it was being poured on the river Euphrates. And in the seventh trumpet, the kingdoms of the world become the kingdoms of our Lord. And the seventh plague was poured upon the air, and it is done. So we have a very strong evidence to prove that the trumpets are definitely part of the plagues. In other words, the trumpets are a set of events that are supposed to be fulfilled in the future. Now, the teaching that interprets the 1 hour silence as the second coming of Jesus also teach that the trumpets are not part of the seventh seal, but they are a set of events that should take place before the commencement of the seven last plagues. Now, the evidence that I use to sustain this view is taken from the fact that after the description of the sixth trumpet in chapter 9 ends, we are immediately taken to chapter 10, which prophesies about an event which was already fulfilled about 200 years ago. And chapter 11 verses 1 to 14 also describes events that should take place before the time of probation ends, or before the plagues begin to fall. Now, these set of events are represented in this picture by this green portion here in between the sixth and the seventh trumpet. In other words, between the sixth and the final trumpet, there are a series of events that have been inserted that seems to be taking place before the great day of God's wrath. So if we consider these events in chapter 10 and 11 as part of a chain of events that are a continuation of the sixth trumpet, then it is logical to conclude that the trumpets are not part of the seventh seal, and that they are separate events that should take place before probation ends. But once again, we read the following about the fifth trumpet. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. So this verse is self-evidently clear that it is talking about an event after the sealing has taken place. In other words, it is talking of something that is yet to be fulfilled. So how do we explain this seemingly contradictory scenario? The seventh trumpet deals with one of the most, if not the most, auspicious event in the history of the Christian church, which is the finishing of the mystery of God. And we read about this in Revelation chapter 10 verse 7. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished, as he hath declared to his servants the prophets. So by now you would know that the mystery of God refers to the fact that Christ lives in us. It is Christ in you, the hope of glory. That is the mystery that we're talking about here. But before we go there, God pauses the vision of the trumpets and takes us back to a set of events that helps us to understand the significance of what the finishing of his mystery has when the seventh trumpet finally is being sounded. So this scenario is very similar to the one that we witness when we were dealing with the seals, especially seal number 6 and seal number 7. If you remember, after the end of seal number 6, instead of going immediately and studying seal number 7, the vision of the seals stopped or paused for a while, and we are taken to another event which deals with the question, who shall be able to stand? And then only we are taken to study the vision concerning the seventh seal, which we are dealing with in this particular lesson. So this is what I want to share with you in this lesson. And in the next lesson, we are going to look at Revelation chapter 10. So until then, may God be with you for the glory of God and His Son. Amen.